Good morning, everybody. Eli Perry here again, back with another video. Before I get started, I want to address two things. First off, I'm still not sure what direction this channel is going to be going in the future, but it appears to be morphing somewhat from a channel dealing specifically with propaganda, how it works, and all that stuff you remember from my first few videos, and into rather a discussion of propaganda as it is being utilized in the context of the Trump administration and the Russian war in Ukraine. To that end, I am having to do a lot more digging into news and current events in order to, in order to get at the truth of things, chase down woozles, make sure that I'm getting correct information, and also to make sure that I'm reacting to things that are worthy of reaction. Because part of what's going on here, and which has been happening since about 5 minutes after Mr. Trump was sworn in, is that his administration is using an old technique, a variant of, or perhaps a refinement of, no reality propaganda, in which they are essentially putting out enormous numbers of government orders of various types so quickly and in such volume that it's not really possible to examine them fully and react to them properly before something else comes along. If you remember from my video on woozle hunts proper, part of the way that woozle hunts get used in propaganda is that, you just start several of them all at once or in rapid succession so that nobody has enough time or energy to chase down the provenance of the information, what the information actually means, what the context is, any of that. And that is in large part what we're seeing from the White House right now. There have been, at last count, a couple of hundred executive orders or executive memoranda to various departments, some of them illegal on their face for various reasons. At least a few of them appear to have been written by AI, probably by ChatGPT. And so it's very, very difficult to parse what's actually happening. And this is part of the reason that I haven't commented on very much of what we've seen. But I am going to be commenting on more of that moving forward because we need to look at the environment, the context in which propaganda is being used in order to fully understand how that propaganda is being used and why. Second thing I want to address is a couple of people brought it to my attention that Elon Musk and the various Trump functionaries surrounding him may in fact not be actual Nazis, because one of the defining features of Nazism is anti-Semitism. And while the MAGA movement on the ground frequently has strongly anti-Semitic views, the people at the top are a bit ambivalent about that kind of thing. Many of them are very vocal supporters of Israel. Several of them are Jewish themselves. So there's really two possibilities there. The first is that we're dealing with a bunch of capos. And for those of you who are familiar with the functioning of the Nazi concentration camps, capos were Jewish prisoners who collaborated with the Nazis in a long-term way, not merely in order to survive, but in order to gain favors or more favorable living conditions or simply power over others for themselves. That's a possibility. Ben Shapiro, I'm looking at you. The other possibility is that we're not dealing here with actual Nazis, but with something more akin to Mussolinian fascists, the Italian fascists. Now, the Italian fascists were every bit as deranged and conspiracy-minded and dedicated to their cult of personality as the Nazis were, but they were a bit less racist. They were not so bluntly anti-Semitic. They didn't participate in the Holocaust in the same way or to the same level of intensity that we saw with actually Nazi movements in a couple of other countries, like in Slovakia, for instance. But they were every bit as crazy, and if you can believe this, even more incompetent, disorganized, and shit at their jobs. In some ways, that seems like almost a better fit than Nazism for the Trump people. I'm not sure exactly which variant of fascism we're dealing with here, but let's call it what it is. This movement is approaching fascism. Many of the people in that movement are openly fascist, looking at you, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, et cetera, et cetera. And like fascist movements all over the world, it is prioritizing loyalty to the leader over competence in the job, even if the job itself is one that the cult of the leader says is important. I don't think you'd find a Trump voter anywhere who would argue that the job of the Secretary of Defense is not important. But in order to fill that job, they have nominated and now confirmed, there's really no polite way to put this, a raging drunk. I mean, it worked with Ulysses S. Grant, but he was at least good at his job and known for some organizational talent. Hegseth is not. Let's just leave it at that. But moving on, I wanted to get to today's topic fairly quickly. This is still a developing story. Part of what's been going on over the last few days is that several of these orders and memoranda from the Trump administration have hit the news, generated a bunch of confusion and a bunch of upset, and then been rescinded or walked back partly or wholly. And then a couple of them, the president has just come out and said, well, yes, we rescinded the memo, but we're still doing the thing. So I wanted to address this as quickly as possible so that we could get this on record. And that is Mr. Trump's order, which came down sometime last night, my time, to radically expand the U.S. facility, the detention facility at the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Now, this is important. Guantanamo Bay is not actually American soil. American embassies are American soil. American aircraft carriers are American soil, but Guantanamo Bay is not. Guantanamo Bay, aka GITMO, is actually leased from Cuba and has been since the end of the Spanish-American War. And because it is not technically speaking American territory, it was in Guantanamo Bay that the Bush regime decided to site their black detention and torture facility. And everybody knew that's what it was. Everyone knew that Guantanamo Bay was a torture hell. And that's evidenced by the fact that by about, 2007 or so, that reputation was being leveraged in popular media. One of the most interesting pieces of widely disseminated social propaganda from the Bush regime and the Obama regime was a television program called NCIS. NCIS stands for Naval Criminal Investigative Service. And it was a sort of police procedural / action / occasional comedy. And I watched a lot of NCIS over the years. Because the fact is, it's good television. It's very well written. The characters are ambiguous morally and personally, and they're very well fleshed out. The acting is great. Some of the storylines are really compelling. But what it really is propaganda in favor of Bush-era policies like extraordinary rendition, torture, all of that. It's beautifully well done. It's some of the most masterfully executed propaganda I've ever seen, but that's what it is. The whole point of programs like that, and of NCIS in particular, was to legitimize the use of extraordinary rendition, torture, and surveillance in anti-terrorism contexts. But within the context of the show, GITMO, Guantanamo Bay, was used numerous times as a threat to coerce suspects to talk to the investigators who formed the central cast of the program. And the reason that it worked in the show, and the reason that all of us as audience members knew what was going on here, is because everyone knew that GITMO was where the United States sent you to be tortured and, if necessary, disappeared. There were a couple of scandals where people ended up in Guantanamo Bay who had absolutely no connection to torture, or to terrorism, excuse me. Typically because they had been denounced by a neighbor during a land feud or something of that sort back home in Afghanistan or in Iraq. Those people were not released. And the regime's rationale for this was that, well, they weren't terrorists before, but they probably are now, because we just spent 8 years torturing them for no reason. So they kept them there. Yesterday, Mr. Trump signed an order to expand the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay from being able to hold somewhere between a few hundred and 1,000 people, prisoners, to a minimum prisoner capacity of 30,000 people. Now, the way this will probably be spun, the way it will be talked about in the propaganda ecosystem, at least at first, is almost certainly as being expanded in order to house large numbers of prisoners connected to the Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. Now, to be clear, these cartel guys are some of the most violent, most ruthless, vilest human beings to ever walk the face of God's earth. But Mr. Trump has been very clear that he intends to treat the cartels and immigrant smuggling groups and really anything connected to organized crime or organized civil disobedience in Latin America and along the southern U.S. border as terroristic, as connected to terrorism. So there's going to be a lot more enemy combatants grabbed up and sent to GITMO, appears to be what's going on here. And that's certainly the way that it's going to be talked about at first. It's important to note that Guantanamo Bay is effectively a black hole. A large percentage of the people who went to Guantanamo Bay have never really been very well accounted for. Some of them have been sent to trial in the United States and been convicted for terrorism-related offenses, but the majority went to GITMO, stayed in GITMO, and maybe went home in a few cases. I'm not really sure. For one thing, a lot of that information is secret or top secret. It's classified, it's compartmented, it's either way not something that I am ever going to have access to. So I have no way of verifying that. But that seems to be what happened. And there's something else. Unless you've spent a lot of time in sort of right-wing online spaces, most people are not aware of a particular fixation that the harder, more MAGA, more openly fascist end of Trump's base. And Trump's base is not hugely wide, but there is some distance between your sort of garden variety, low information Trump voter and the true believers. And over here we find folks like Christopher Cantwell, Enrico Tarrio, Stuart Rhodes, and their followers and hangers-on. And in that sector of Trump's base, there has been for many years a darkly semi-humorous but entirely sincere obsession with something called Argentine helicopter rides. Now, for those of you who have the good fortune not to be enormously familiar with this is a reference to the fact that during the period in Argentine history known as the Dirty War, part of the ruling junta's SOP was to dispose of politically or socially dissident or inconvenient people in a very interesting way. Their preferred method for both terrorizing their population, disposing of individuals, and avoiding direct accountability was to grab up undesirables. And this could be anything from a student newspaper editor to a person who'd made a joke at a party to nuns who advocated for land reform. And cram them into the back of a helicopter, usually a CH-47 Chinook, sometimes into the backs of aircraft for the really large, or airplanes for the really large loads, Often these people would be sedated in order to prevent them from struggling or attempting to take over the aircraft. And then they would simply be thrown out of the aircraft over the ocean at an altitude of several thousand feet. Now, this did several things. First off, it obviously killed the people. Second thing it did was it prevented easy identification of the bodies. Hitting the water at 120, 150 miles an hour, that's like hitting concrete. I'll leave the exact details up to your imagination, but suffice to say that easy identification from facial features would be rendered impossible by impact with the water. Furthermore, the bodies would be scavenged by ocean-going wildlife, primarily sharks, crabs, predatory and scavenging animals like that. So by the time the bodies washed up on the Argentine coast, they would be largely unidentifiable. There's actually a harrowing sequence regarding this in the film The Two Popes. Can't recommend that movie strongly enough. That sequence is part of why. Now, do I think that this expanded facility in Guantanamo Bay is going to become Trump's new Vernichtungslager? No, probably not, at least not at first. But it will provide a way to do that plausibly if someone in his government decides to do it. Argentine helicopter rides are something that his people have been making jokes about for a long, long time. And there's an awful lot of water with an awful lot of sharks between the coast of Florida and Cuba. I want everybody to keep this in mind because one of the techniques of authoritarian governments, and Trump is obviously doing this with some of these memos and orders, is to continuously test people's boundaries. Push, pull back. Push a little further, pull back. Push a little further, pull back. Stretch and contract. Stretch and contract. And before you know it, you're here. And people always say they never saw it coming. Keep your eyes on what's being said about what's being done. Because some things are being done to push and then pull back and push and then pull back and slowly expand what people will tolerate. This is one of them. Watch out for woozle hunts in this as well, folks. There's an awful lot of information running around out there about what is said and what isn't. Mr. Trump's government is still, for the moment, publishing the text of these orders online. If something sounds particularly outlandish, go to the website, check it out for yourself. Read the actual order. Yes, many of them are rambling, masturbatory, self-congratulating, and in many cases, nonsensical. It's not easy. But check this out for yourself. Don't be fooled by people telling you that this isn't happening or it isn't what you think or they don't really mean it that way. They do. They might not mean it that way for the reason you think they do, at least not at first, but they do mean it that way. Remember, Donald Trump is an idiot. The people behind him very much are not. Don't trust but verify, people. Just verify.